Sometimes I wonder what God is doing. Ever been in that situation? I think, God, what on earth is going on? Quite clearly, I'm not the only one in that bracket. Well, our passage today, Mark 7:31 to the end of the chapter, takes us into a place where we can explore that idea and perhaps get something of an answer about wondering how God does and why he does the things that he does. Someone had a birthday through the week, and my daughter phoned, and we got to talk about what would it be like. Would either of us like to go back and be teens again? The answer was very definitely no. No, not a chance. But when someone's 18, graduated from high school, they know everything that is possible to know. There is no field where they cannot give an answer. Whereas way down the track, someone older, they would think knows absolutely nothing at all. Do you know why it is that when you get to be that old, that you try to recall something and it's just not there for the moment? There's a very good reason for that, and the answer is the space that was allocated to facts and trivia and data has been replaced by other stuff that's much more important. And so while you might appear to lose knowledge in growing older, the good news is that you get older and some people get wiser as well. How do you do that? It really does help to capture a sense of wonder. Little children have this sense of wonder. What a wonderful world it is. And they grow in all sorts of ways. If we're going to grow spiritually, capturing a sense of the wonder of God really does help. Now, let's come into our passage. The first thing we see in the first couple of verses is sometimes I don't know what God is doing. I would like to, but there are just some times where I don't know what God is doing. We're close, but he hasn't given me all the answers. Now, I know that God has a plan, a big plan for the entire cosmos, for the universe, for the spiritual and physical universe that's out there. He has a plan for everything. We get a hint of it in Ephesians 1:10. When the times reach their fulfillment, so it's still yet to happen, to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. That's the big picture plan that God has. Everything is going to come together and worship Christ, be under his rule. That's the big picture for the universe. He also has a big picture for me personally. While we're in Ephesians, just over the page to chapter 4, I know God has a plan for me, and this is what it is: to become mature. That's the plan. That's God's plan for me, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. What does maturity look like? It looks just like Jesus Christ. And the more I become like him, then I can say, I'm not just growing older, I'm growing up. I'm growing to be like him. Now this, again, big picture stuff. I'm to become mature. I do have a problem with the smaller stuff, the day-to-day stuff. You know the saying, I can't see the forest for the trees. Well, I can see the forest. The big picture stuff, the whole forest, that's pretty clear. But going through the forest and this day-to-day walk, I tend to crash into trees and trip over stray roots, and it's a little difficult on a day-to-day basis to live up to that big picture plan that God has for my life. Thank you. So, into our text, and what does it say? In the region of Decapolis, some people brought Jesus a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place their hands on him. I don't know, and I do suspect that this fellow, this deaf mute, had very little say in what was happening. Notice that he didn't come to Jesus, but they brought him to Jesus. Can you picture what it must be like for this fellow? What was it like for someone who is probably not part of the deaf community, but someone who is just deaf? And when you can't hear, then it's so hard to learn. And so, because he couldn't hear words, it's no wonder that he could hardly speak, because he hasn't heard words formed. And because he couldn't hear, because he couldn't speak, he was probably regarded as quite stupid as a child, probably abused, probably mocked and laughed at. No one wanted him, and he's probably isolated. But now, Jesus arrives, and all these people who have either ignored him or laughed at him think, here's a great opportunity to see a miracle. Let's grab old, whatever his name is, old Fred. And I wonder what went through the poor fellow's mind as this crowd descended on him, as they grabbed him. No one could tell him what was going on. They just up and took him. I would think he must have been terrified, afraid, scared, wondering what was happening to him. What were they going to do to him? No one had been kind to him. What a terrible thing. But they brought him to Jesus, fortunately. Now, do you recognise this as a map? Most of you do. Okay, Mediterranean Sea, Sea of Galilee, River Jordan, Dead Sea. Does it make sense? Okay. In Jesus' day, the Jews lived in two areas. Galilee, obviously around the Sea of Galilee. You get places like Nazareth and Capernaum, etc. And then down in the south, you've got Judea, and that was based on their capital city of Jerusalem. That's where the Jews lived. There were no-go zones for them, though. Up the north, the area of Tyre, that's where the Phoenicians were. This is where evil Queen Jezebel came from. This is the worst of the worst, apart from the other worst of the worsts. But that was definitely a no-go zone. Over on the coast, there's the area around the city of Caesarea. Do you need three guesses to work out who was based at Caesarea? Okay, this was the Roman headquarters that governed the whole district. The Romans, that was definitely a no-go zone as well. On the other side, inland, got the area of the Decapolis. Now, let's do some word testing for you. This is as bad as being back in school. Deca and polis. Do you want to have a go at polis first of all? What's a word that we often use that ends in polis? Metropolis. Okay, so it's about cities. Deca, want to have a go at Deca? 10. It's the area of the 10 towns. And this is an area where, when Alexander the Great's armies dissipated, they resettled lots of Greeks over in these towns. Greeks, no-go zone. And then in the centre, you've got Samaria. They were the worst of the worst. When the Assyrians and Babylonians were carting people off, the Samaritans were those who were the mixed group. There were lots of no-go zones. Why do I tell you all this? Because Jesus is messing with our minds. Oh, before we get to that, The Jews they've never been good at multiculturalism. If you want to get from one of their comfort zones to the other, it was across the River Jordan and then down through no man's land and back again. Got to avoid these Gentiles at all costs. But what does Jesus do? Well, last week we saw he went to Tyre, this Syrophoenician woman. That's not how good Jews are supposed to function. And then here, where does he go? The area of the Decapolis. Again, he's stepping outside what is normal and comfortable, and I think to myself, I wonder what God is doing. It wasn't what I would have planned. If I'd been on the Good Jews planning committee for Jesus' first coming, then he wouldn't have gone anywhere near those places. But here he is doing something different. Jesus does odd things. Things that I don't understand and can't explain, and I still don't get all of what he's doing. How do you feel about that? How do you feel when God does things that you haven't told him to do? You've told him how to function, how to operate the universe, and then he goes and does something completely different. That's because he's God, not me. And it's no wonder that if I was to be anybody at all in this story, I would be the deaf mute. If I was part of what was happening here, this would be me. I don't understand everything that happens. I don't get what God is doing. I know he's doing something fabulous, but I just don't see how it fits. And then when you start probing scripture, it only gets worse rather than better. Go all the way back to Exodus, Genesis, Exodus. We're talking the first few pages in the Bible. Exodus 4, we read God speaking. Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? God is in charge. God knows who you are. He made you the way that he made you because he is Lord over all things. We look at some of our superficial attributes, but God's always interested in looking far deeper than that. I've got a question for you now. Now, please don't answer out loud, but do answer because this is important. When you look at yourself, what would you say is your greatest limitation? What's your disability? Where do you not function? No, only one is sufficient, one area at a time. Or my self-frustration. The thing that makes me frustrated with myself, the limitation that I keep on bumping up against, where I can't function. Answer that just to yourself, just between you and God. Like, Lord, this is the area where I struggle. This is me. Got that? Because when you get up close, it's a bit hard to work out what on earth is happening. And sometimes you just need to step back and get a little bit of perspective and see things not face to tree, but to see something of the forest, to see something of the beach. You get a better perspective on what God is doing. Because if we think only about this little bit, it's all about me, then we miss the beach, we miss the ocean, where there's so much more to be seen. Way over near the back of the Bible, we have little letter 1 John. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Let's just look at that a little more closely for a bit. Dear friends, now we are children of God. You have now all the resources that God needs you to have in order to live a mature, Christ-like, balanced, joyful, peaceful life. You've got it now because of who you are. You are now a child of God. But there's the steak knives. We always want more. And there is. What we will be has not yet been made known. There's more to come. The best is yet to come. Things are going to get even better than they are right now, because we go from the beach to the resort. But we know when Christ appears, we shall be like him. It will have been completed. We will arrive at that point where we're suddenly Christ-like, where we're at last mature, for we shall not just see him, but we'll get to see, that's why. I didn't understand it at the time, but it starts to make sense to me now. The best is yet to come. The best is yet to come. It looks like the end for a caterpillar, but really it's the beginning for the butterfly. Two caterpillars were talking on a leaf one day. One said to the other, "You'll never get me up in one of those things," looking at the butterfly. But that's where we're headed. As amazing and different as it seems, that's exactly what God has in mind for us. Because the Bible assures us that the best is yet to come. It's a butterfly book for caterpillars. So let's move on back into our text of Mark chapter 7. When we come into verse 33, we find that Jesus explains what God is doing. You want to know what God is doing? Then you look to Jesus as the first port of call. Jesus explains what God is doing. Well, we read in that verse, after he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears and then spat and touched the man's tongue. So look at the process that's going on here. This crowd has grabbed and dragged this fellow, terrified fellow, away from his comfort zone and brought him to someone he's never heard about and never seen. So what does Jesus do? He does something that's very compassionate and very gracious. And he took him aside. He took him away from the crowd. The crowd were just looking for the spectacular. But Jesus is looking for something more personal and deeper. And so Jesus takes him away from everybody, all the curious, all the lollygaggers. And what does he do? He put his fingers in the man's ears. He's explaining to him what is going to happen. He spat. Probably the fellow's got some sort of disability, and so he's going to touch his tongue, explaining again in the simplest language what is going to happen. I love this picture. This is so indicative of how Jesus functions. So Jesus is and gives simple visual explanation. He speaks at my level of understanding. For you see what's happening? Jesus takes this confused and terrified fellow away from the crowd, and he wants to deal with him one-on-one. He wants to deal with this person who is me, wants to deal with me down at my level. He speaks to me in my language. He makes it as simple as possible. He brings it down to the ABC. That is the heart of Jesus. It's what he wants to do. He comes to you at your level, speaks your language, so that you can understand what you need to hear. How often did Jesus say, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear"? How many people actually listen or want to know? So who is Jesus? Who is this person who comes seemingly out of nowhere to meet with just this fellow in this strange place? He is so many rich and varied things. He is God at work. And Jesus is the jam on my bread. It's Jesus and me, because that's what he wants. Just the two of us together. We can go further than that and push that in the next couple of verses and say that Jesus not only explains what God is doing, but now we see Jesus is what God is doing. And if we want to see God in action, we keep coming back to Jesus. To see Jesus in action is to see God in action. Jesus is what God is doing. And so he looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh, against all body language, said to him, "Ephphatha," which means be opened. At this the man's ears were open and his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak plainly. This is so generous and so gracious. Jesus enables me to function more fully. He makes me totally human. He makes me whole. He gives me what I need. He enables me to function up to all that I can be in this world. And he's got better planned for the future. Jesus also in action for me, whether I understand it or not. And usually I don't. Because God is so gracious that I don't have to know what he's doing in order for him to act for me. And most of the time I blithely sail through life completely unaware of what's happening, of what God is doing for me. And yet here he is, still working consciously, continuously on my behalf. Because God is sovereign. What can I do? It's just one other reason that keeps me humble. But Jesus is God at work. And if you want to know what God is doing, keep coming back to the Gospels. Keep coming back to listen to and to see Jesus in action. And once we see him, then it's much, much easier to walk by faith. Because we see Jesus and then think, God's at work here. I'm okay. I can walk through my forest, through that windy path, and it's okay. And it doesn't matter what explanation I might hear, or what theology I might read, or what sermons I might listen to. Whatever is the explanation, the mystery of who God is and how he functions and what he's doing is a mystery that is always far bigger than any explanation. I cannot put God in my little box that explains him and pulls him out whenever I need an answer for me. He's far too big to fit in anybody's box. The mystery is always going to be far bigger than human minds can comprehend. And so finally, I'm back to my human level question. Jesus, what is God doing? Well, again, we see a little. Look at the contrast here. Some people brought to Jesus a man who was deaf, and what was his problem? He could hardly talk. Jesus healed him. The man's ears were open. His tongue was loosed, and guess what he did? Well, there's no surprise, really. He began to speak plainly. So far, so good. Yeah, I can get that at a human level. But then, so that's verse 35, but verse 36, Jesus commanded them to do what? Not to tell. Yeah, right. Yeah. As if that was going to happen. And the more he did so, the more they kept on talking. What on earth is happening here? Well, actually, in this, we get to see where the problem lies, and it's here. They kept talking about the miracle. They kept talking about the healing. They kept talking about the physical change. But for Jesus, that's just a symbol of a deeper change that he wants to bring. We've been singing about touching heaven and changing earth. But heaven is touching us, not so that it can have some superficial veneer change over us, but so that it can reach deep within us to change our hearts, to change our minds, to change our worldview, to change our attitudes, to change our priorities. And if all we do is just talk about, oh, it's so fun, it's lovely to be a Christian, and they're good, it's a good place to start. But it's not what it's all about. So what we need, keep everything in perspective and remember what's more important. Yes, the healing was a wonderful thing, and it was a blessing for that fellow and for his community and for his family and for his friends. Everyone got a benefit out of it. But it wasn't the main deal. Jesus is about the kingdom of God, not people talking. So we read in the final verse, the people were overwhelmed with amazement. He's done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. It's about he has done everything well. Hang on to that as the verse to take with you. He has done everything well, and he continues to do everything well. This is the big picture. This is who he is. This is how he functions. This is what he's doing for you. Whatever is your limit, your disability, your self-frustration, he's working in that or in spite of that to do that which is good for you. Where does it leave me? Well, I'll never understand everything. I hardly understand anything. I was right first time. I will never understand the bigness or the mystery of God. My human head will never be able to contain all that. Are you okay with that? I hope so, because there's no other alternative. We will never understand everything. But I know some things. I know that God is good, and what he wants for me is good. That's enough. That's what I need to know to relate to him. My prayer, Lord, unblock my ears, release my tongue. I want to be different. I want to be transformed by you at a personal level. Fill me with perspective and thanksgiving. If you want to move towards that maturity, want to move to Christ-likeness, then perspective is seeing things from heaven's viewpoint, not just about the earthly and the immediate. And there's no better way than to open your lips with thanksgiving. Thanksgiving will make the biggest difference. To live with praise, to live with celebration makes all the difference in the world. I love this picture of a forest. If I'm going to walk through the forest, well, there's trees and there's flowers. My prayer, and perhaps this can be your prayer as well. Lord, please help me to move beyond wrestling with things that I'll never understand and move into a place where I can understand a little more of your own heart and know how you are transplanting your heart into me. Is that enough to know for today? More than enough for every day. Let me pray. Father, this is indeed our prayer. We'll never know everything, for we are not God. And thank you for that. I never will know everything that there is to know, but I do know that you care. I do know that you are love. I know that you are sufficient for everything that I will ever need. And I just want to reach out to you and say thank you. Give me that perspective to know you and what you're doing is good. Give me that heart of thanksgiving so that what flows through my lips is more good than bad, and that you will transform me from within. May your heart rest within me so that every day I'm becoming more and more like Jesus. And this I ask in his most precious name. Amen.